I'm Brenda Schufelt, and I'm the History Room Coordinator for the Hudson Area Library, and welcome to this evening. We have a local history talk every month, and we coordinate or collaborate with the Leisler Institute for Early New York History about 4 times a year. We're very grateful for that collaboration. And this month we're going to be looking at Colonial New York as a model for our nation, and Patricia Bonomi is going to present. The lecture is, as I said, one of the series of collaborations in 2022. The Hudson Area Library has a history room that's dedicated to preserving and making accessible local history of Hudson, Greenport, and Stockport, which is our library service areas. And we're open to the public every Saturday from 10 to 1 p.m. We have history room volunteers that make that possible, and it's very lively in there, so you are welcome to come, and also by appointment. We also have online research requests that we will fulfill for free, and you can go to our website, which is historyroom.hudsonarealibrary.org. And I also want to announce that we have the launching of 2 new websites which have our 2 oral history collections in them. We received a grant a couple years ago from the Institute of Museum and Library Services to digitize the collection that was from the 1980s, which is the Black Legacy Association of Columbia County Oral History Project collection. And that had been sitting in boxes and was then donated to us. And thank you, Rick. And it was donated to us, and we were able to digitize the entire collection from VHS tape and archive all of the documents that were associated with it. So we have the full video interviews that were done. There were 16 done of Black citizens in Columbia County about their history, and it goes back to the early 1900s, and it's just beautiful. So that information is also on our website. And it's a separate website, and then we also have a Hudson Area Library oral history collection that is on another website. But all of that information is on our library website and on our history room website. Anyone who is wishing to donate to the library's history room and the Leisler Institute, we split any donations tonight 50-50, and there's a donation box just outside the room here, outside that door, and you can also go on our website and donate. So if you go to historyroom.hudsonarealibrary.org, there's a donate button there, and if you put in the note Leisler Institute, we will also split those donations. So our next Leisler collaboration will be in February 2023, and very near to Valentine's Day, and it's about, what's it about again?
About chocolate.
Oh yeah, it's about chocolate. And the history of chocolate in Colonial New York, so you may want to come to that. Each year we do several programs, as I said, with the Institute. They are an independent, not-for-profit study and research center devoted to collecting, preserving, and disseminating information related to Colonial New York under English rule. We're very grateful for this partnership and to be working with Dr. David Voorhees, the director of the Institute, which is headquartered, we're very lucky, on Green Street in Hudson. David's also the managing editor of The Half Moon, and a quarterly scholarly journal published by the Holland Society of New York. He's an NYU research scientist and a former managing reference history editor at Charles Scribner Sons, and he's published numerous historical works and articles, and been a consultant on historical exhibits at the Museum of the City of New York, the Bard Graduate Center in Manhattan, among many others. So David.
Thank you, Brenda. It is again with much appreciation that I thank the Hudson Area Library for hosting the Jacob Leisler Institute Lecture Series. This series is made possible through generous support of the Van Dyke Family Foundation, the Hudson River Bank and Trust Foundation, and the Bank of Greene County Charitable Foundation, as well as by numerous private donors. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Patricia Bonomi, is well known in the scholarly community. Now Professor Emerita, she taught American history for 27 years at New York University, specializing in the colonial and early national periods. Her groundbreaking books include A Factious People, Politics and Society in Colonial New York, Under the Cope of Heaven, Religion, Society and Politics in Colonial America, and the Lord Cornbury Scandal, The Politics of Reputation in British America, in which she challenges traditional assumptions. Moreover, Dr. Bonomi influenced an entire generation of younger scholars to focus their research on the much neglected colonial New York and New Netherland periods, myself included. The Jacob Leisler Institute is a product of her influence. Dr. Bonomi's discussion this evening will highlight how colonial New York's religious and racial diversity, its unique geography, and its tumultuous politics influenced the development of the United States and contributed to the American identity. Dr. Bonomi.
Okay, well, David, thank you very much for, as always, a lovely introduction. I am so proud of David, and I have one of the students of mine from years ago who was in the audience, so that delights me as well. However, when I ask you questions about certain things, there are certain people in the audience who know they are not supposed to answer. They know all the answers. I want to explore these things. So Colonial New York as a model for the nation is, the idea is the colony of New York. And we know that that means from the beginning of colonization, the very first colony being in Virginia in 1607, up to, but not including the Revolution in this case. It's the period before the Revolution when the people in this state were either in New Netherland or they were part of the British Empire and actually English at that time, citizens of the British Empire. So, this map, for which I have a wonderful gadget, is of all of the colonies along the East Coast as they were first settled. And you see they're divided by the colors into three different groups. New England is the green, the middle colonies are the purple, and the red is the south. Some of those had been found, like Georgia. Well, I'll tell you which ones are in the 17th century, and then some are added in the 18th century. But we used to say in the old textbooks or in teaching this period that these settlers from Europe, the European settlers, left their old world and they came to a new world. We don't say that anymore because we know that this was not a new world to the indigenous tribes that had been here literally for many, many centuries. Nothing was new to them. They had their own culture, their own politics. It was a long settlement, their own cultivation of the land. And it was only when these tribes, these native peoples, were pushed back, and push is the operative word, that this map would have any meaning at all. This is only after or while they're being pushed back. So I'll touch a little bit on the indigenous people because you can't talk about New York without mentioning them because of the Iroquois tribes in the north, the River Indians. They were very much present in New York colonial history as well. But it's not my main focus. What I am going to focus on primarily this evening is the European settlers. So this, let's look at this map first, which as you can see is divided into three regions: New England, the Middle Colonies, and the Southern Colonies. So colonial New England consisted of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, but we sort of have to exclude Rhode Island because it's the different state, the different colony that proved the case for all the rest. It was not the same as the others. So it's mainly Massachusetts, actually, Connecticut probably we'll be talking about. The middle colonies included, can you hear me at the back of the room? Okay.
Yes.
All right, good. The middle colonies included, of course, New York, and New Jersey initially was part of New York. It was not a separate colony till later in the 18th century when it became a royal colony, as New York was at that time. And then Pennsylvania, of course, is the other one, with Delaware at the very end of the colonial period hiving off from Pennsylvania as a fourth colony. And the South initially was mainly Virginia and Maryland around the Chesapeake, and then Carolina toward later in the 17th century, and which was divided, of course, into two parts, and then Georgia in the 18th century. So those are the colonies we're going to talk about, mainly New York. But before we get to New York, main focus, let's look at these three regions and see if we can determine a little something about them that might, in the end, tell us quite a bit about New York. Because what happens, if you look at an American history textbook, you will find that they start, and this is still true, I went to my local library shortly before I came up here, hoping that this had changed, but it hadn't. The textbooks are just the same as they were 40 years ago, usually. Now there are exceptions. The textbooks, when they're talking about the colonial period, they always start with New England, even though it was founded after Virginia. And we'll hear a good deal about New Hampshire, not so much about that, but Massachusetts and Connecticut mainly. And then they leap directly to the South, Virginia and Maryland maybe being the first two colonies established. And then if you're very, very lucky, you might get a wee paragraph at most about the middle region. Sometimes they don't even mention that. It's just north and south. And then they launch right into the story of the colonies and the revolution and so on. So this is a very frustrating thing for New York historians, and I don't approve of it at all. And we're going to try to figure out together why this is so. All right, so we're going to, if you will help me out here, let's brainstorm a little bit. When I say to you, colonial, this is the colonial period, colonial New England, what images, words pop into your minds? What would you, when you think about who was there in colonial New England, who the settlers were, what life was like there, what pops into your head? Who came over from England to settle New England first?
Puritans.
The Puritans, okay, exactly. The Puritans were the original settlers. Mayflower had come in 1620, but then the big migration was 1630s on, and it certainly was a Puritan colony. Some people used to say that the Puritans came for religious liberty. Well, sort of, but not exactly, because they came for religious liberty for themselves, but nobody else. And if people disagreed with anything that was happening in New England religion in those days, they were ousted. You know, perhaps you've heard of Roger Williams and Hutchinson, both of whom, though they were Puritans, later called Congregationalists, that's the same church. Both Williams and Ann Hutchinson were ousted, ejected. And of course they went to Rhode Island, as the rejections from New England did in those days. And the New Englanders called Rhode Island the latrina of New England. Took their waste product. Okay, so anything else that pops into your head about the Puritan congregational area? What about Salem? Salem, Massachusetts, tip anything off?
Witch trials.
Witch trials, exactly. A whole period of sort of witch hysteria that occurred in the is appropriate since we're near Halloween. And 20 people were executed as a result of those trials. Most of them, I believe I'm right about this, women. Usually women were the main ones who were accused as witches. In Europe, certainly that was true, and probably somewhat here too. Okay, so this was, I think we agree, not a tolerant area, not a tolerant religion, very intolerant in fact. Did you know, for instance, that 4 Quakers were hanged by the Boston Puritans in the middle of the 17th century? One of them was a woman, Mary Dyer. They didn't like people who objected to their religion, and they did terrible things to them. So the point is, though, I mean, they're not all terrible, obviously. They very much, everybody believed that whatever their church was or whatever their religion was, they had the truth, and nobody else did. This was typical of the 17th century. This church, the Puritan and later Congregational Church, was the established church of New England, not in Rhode Island, but everywhere else. People had to pay a tax for it. You had to support the churches with your taxes. So just remember that it's an established church that New England has. Okay, now let's do the same thing that the textbooks do and we to the south. So the southern region, what words or images occur to you about the South, the colonial South in particular?
Plantations.
Pardon me?
Plantations.
Plantations, okay. It is true that there are some very large plantations in the South. Most of the small farms, however, but we hear about the plantations because those were the people who got all the publicity and held all the offices. And that's true. It was an agrarian economy also. I forgot to mention New England has a maritime economy, shipping, shipbuilding, fishing, of course, whereas in the South, it's different. How did those plantations come about? What was the labor on those plantations in the South?
Slavery.
Okay, slavery, exactly. We've heard a good deal about this lately because of the 1619 projects, and there's more than one, where the first slaves arrived on a ship, a Dutch ship actually, in the South with the first group of slaves that came into the South. So slavery certainly, I think, is perhaps the main image that we have, although it's not only in the South, as you know. An agrarian economy with certainly some large plantations. Both George Washington and Thomas Jefferson had over 200 slaves on their plantations each. What about the religion? Anybody know anything about what religion? Now, I will simply give you a hint. There was an established church in the South, also particularly in Virginia and also Maryland later. It was the Church of England, Anglican Church, was established because the people who settled there were directly from England, and often the kind of a cavalier group initially, the younger sons of earls and dukes in England. Okay, and their economy we've already mentioned is an agrarian one. Only one city, Charleston, in the South. Okay, now let's go to the middle colonies. What pops into your head about the middle colonies?
Dutch.
I couldn't hear something I heard.
The Dutch.
The Dutch, okay, good. That's a very good. I'm glad you know about it because a lot of people don't, I'm afraid. Well, they're getting to know about it a lot more than they used to because of the translation project of the Dutch records up in Albany. And so we know that the Dutch certainly were first in New York. But it's harder, I think, to say, have one strong image about exactly what the middle colonies were. Because there's not one word that describes them all, except possibly diversity. Diversity of peoples, diversity of religions. So let me just take a bit of a deeper dive into this. Ethnic and racial pluralism happened from the very beginning. Yes, the Dutch were first in New York, that is true for 40 years. And then in 1664, the English came in and took over. So we certainly had Dutch people, but even in the Dutch period, because the Dutch states in Europe were sort of a haven for people escaping from problems that still were lasting for centuries after the Reformation. And so some of them had found haven there from other states in Europe. So you had Dutch, Reformed, you had Lutherans from a very early period, Anglicans, Church of England, there were some, mainly New Englanders who came in, Presbyterians, Moravians, Quakers from a very early period actually. And in 1686, there was a traveler to New York who saw all these different groups and all these different religions, and he couldn't believe it, so I'm going to quote what he said. Yes, Quakers, but then he added singing Quakers, ranting Quakers, Sabbatarians, anti-Sabbatarians, some Anabaptists, some Independents, some Jews, in short, all sorts of opinion. Therefore, do you have an established church in the new colonies? You can't. There's no way with all of this diversity that you could possibly put one church above the other, although the Anglicans tried very hard, especially in New York, because of course the English sent over the governors for these colonies, the royal colonies like New York became. But you couldn't have an established church. So already you see, possibly, if you're following my argument about New York as a model for what will come later, when we later separate church from state, they got a lot of their ideas from what had worked in New York and Pennsylvania. Ethnic pluralism, racial pluralism, I started to mention. You had, of course, the native people tribes, the Iroquois and so on, but also the river tribe. And throughout the middle colonies, there were many different indigenous people, certainly. So you also had Africans from the very beginning in New York. I think it's only 3 or 4 years after New Netherland was established in 1624 that the first slaves, or blacks, not definitely maybe slaves yet because the system was still developing, who came into New York. But later, in the 18th century, New York had the highest percentage of blacks of any northern colony, maybe as much as 20% times in the 18th century, a good part of the 18th century. And because the Dutch colony had been pretty good about freeing a number of their blacks, some of these blacks were free. They weren't all slaves, though most of them certainly were. Okay, so we've talked about particularly religious groups recently, but there's one big group of Christian group, very large, that I haven't mentioned. Anybody know what that is? What's maybe, I think maybe the largest Christian group in the United States today, the Roman Catholics. Hardly any of those in New York. In the middle colonies more, but New York was not fond of the Roman Catholics, and I will tell you why, or we will work out why a little bit later. But right now I'm going to simply use that as a segue to the next topic. I'm going to put my glasses down because thanks to this wonderful setup, I don't actually need them. I can hardly believe it. The next thing that I want to say the words about is, in terms of sort of sketching the character now of New York, is its geography. And for that, I'm forgetting that I'm the one who's supposed to be doing these wonderful slides. So let me show you. This is a 18th century, I have to admit, sketch of New York City, where the skyline isn't sky spires, but church spires. And of course, it didn't really look quite like that. This is a bit exaggerated, but nonetheless, you see they're all named. There are actually 18, this is the 1770s in fact, but I love this so much I had to show it to you to represent the diversity of religion in New York. There are 18 churches in this woodblock. Well, 17 churches and one synagogue. And they and some of the other major buildings are listed there. It's a wonderful woodblock. And so, let me get to where I want to be here. Okay, so that does not have anything to do with geography, but now we're going to go back to geography that I was starting to tell you about. This is another map that is a wonderful map that intrigues me. I used it in one of my books. It is a population map that was worked out about where the people who came first to the colonies settled. And it's actually, the date of this is 1650, still very early in the 17th century, and each of those dots represents 200 people. So you can see they're all along the waterways. Because, why? Because you didn't have any roads to begin with, and if you had an Indian trail that you were trying to use as a road and it rained and got all muddy and you couldn't travel on it anyway. So the main way you traveled was by boat. So of course you would stay near the water, and you see in New England everybody's pretty well settled along the water, Cape Cod, and then you get to Connecticut, a little bit of passage up the Connecticut River, I think that is. New York along the waterway, it's only in western Long Island at this point, because the migration to eastern Long Island comes a little later, but then there are people out of the eastern end, we'll get to in a minute. And in the south, of course, around Chesapeake Bay and the Atlantic, and then where there are rivers in the south, you see a little bit of inland progress going up those rivers. All right, but in fact, look at New York. See if I can help you do that. I can remember how to get this. Here you go. This is the Hudson River, right up here. Look how far inland New Yorkers go, and this is only 1650, mind you. They're all the way up to Albany, and even I think one dot out on the Mohawk River. Why? Because the Dutch came over for furs, and also they had that wonderful river, so they immediately could get into the interior, up to where the Iroquois tribes were, even eventually some Great Lakes tribes, and they'd get the furs, and that's what the Dutch wanted out of New Netherland in the initial period. There actually were 3 distinct regions also of New York itself. This is one of them, the Hudson Valley. And there you know who settled where, often because of the names of the villages and towns. And even today, some of them still retain those names. For example, Kinderhook, we know was settled by the Dutch. Peekskill, anything with a kill on the end of it was settled by the Dutch initially. And then there's Albany. That's not Dutch, that's English. But James II, who we'll talk about when we get to Leisler, or we will get to Leisler, was, before he became King James II of England, was the Duke of York and Albany. And that's where both New York and Albany get their name, was from his title. Okay, so that's one region, very important one. Long Island is another separate region. And Hempstead, which is about where there was no Nassau County in those early days, but that's kind of where the English part begins, in Hempstead, which is an English name. And then, of course, all those Hamptons, East Hampton, South Hampton, all the rest, out on the east end of Long Island, that was settled by New Englanders coming over from Connecticut mainly. Southold, which is on the North Fork. And its economy was whaling, fishing, and of course agriculture later. And then the third area is New York City and its environment. With its mixture of people, you can't talk about a single type of person there. because it's all those groups we mentioned before. And that there, because of the natural deep harbor, you had, of course, a lot of commerce, shipping, trade. That was mainly what the occupations were in, or things related to that in New York City. Okay, so now there's another geographic thing that I want to mention. This is obviously an anachronistic map because it says United States, but nonetheless it shows you something that I wanted to be able to show, which is that this corridor where's my red thing?
It's way over there.
Oh, I'm putting it in the wrong place. How am I doing this? Oh, here we go. Okay. You start in New York, you go up the Hudson River, then a little bit into Lake George, a bit of an overland bridge into Lake Champlain, then on up into the St. Lawrence Seaway to Montreal, Quebec, and out to the Atlantic. This is the major military corridor in the long 18th century. There were 4 big wars in Europe, and in that long, I'm talking about the very late 17th century through actually a 5th war, the Napoleonic Wars at the end of the 18th century. During that stretch, there were kind of 4 wars among Europe before the Napoleonic Wars, and each of those had an echo in the colonies. The last one, actually more than an echo, that was the French and Indian War, and that was a major engagement, certainly. But this military corridor affected the life of New York very deeply because it made New York very important in all the wars, and also in another, well, the headquarters of the British Navy was New York. When you see those pictures of all those big ships, frigates and English ships, English flags, that was real. That harbor was filled with shipping because it was also the headquarters of the Navy. And also there were Army forces actually settled on New York soil, British forces, a regiment, 2 companies in Albany, 2 companies in New York City to protect against these possible attacks, which would come right down this corridor from the French into the English colonies or the English into New France. So this is, all of these, I'm trying to show you what the characteristics are, or what geography does, and other mixtures of populations and so on do to create New York as a colony and later as a state, and a very important one for the later nation. Also, I said I promised you that I would say something about Roman Catholics. The reason the Roman Catholics are not welcome in New York is exactly because of this corridor. And I'm going to show even a better picture of it, which the library found for me. Now you really see this New York, starting in New York, you go up the Hudson, and you can see how these rivers and the lakes are pretty much connected with not much need to drag your cannon over the land bridges, and then on up into Canada, which doesn't show there, of course. Okay, so these elements that we've just discussed, that is the ethnic and religious and racial diversity, the geography, the settlement of people in these little groups, often with like people, the little towns and villages, especially up the Hudson River. This all gave shape to the colony of New York's political life. And so I'd like to turn to politics now because I love politics to begin with, and I like to talk about it, and I think New Yorkers are fascinating. And also, in my view, the New York politics, above all, are what foreshadowed what the nation would become. That's a little hard to say today because our politics are difficult, to say the least. We've had difficult periods before, but New York had a great influence on the politics of the nation, so let's take a look. New York was unique from the other colonies in one particular way, and that is that it was 67 years after the New York colony was established by the Dutch, and then taken over by the English before they had a General Assembly, that is, any kind of an elected assembly. In each colony, in imitation of Parliament in England, was supposed to have one place where the people could legislate for their colony, express their grievances, and so on. New York did not have one for 67 years, and it's a long time. In Massachusetts, it was 2 years before their assembly was established. In Virginia, the House of Burgesses was established after 12 years, and the longest period for any other colony was 19 years. But there was this long gap in New York. And the result of this was that the politics was very much localized. It was fractured into these small towns and villages as they developed, particularly in the 17th century. And each village and town had its own local board of governors, local board to govern the town, of course, and usually it's called the Board of Trustees. I live in Westchester County, and everything along the river in my area, they're all called the Board of Trustees. I'm curious about Hudson, because I believe Hudson was settled by New Englanders first, am I right? And whaling, notice I'm wearing my whale. I don't know if you saw that. I got this on the beach in Puerto Rico for $12. But it's real bone. So these boards are elected, so I'm just curious to know, since Hudson was established by New Englanders, what is your local board called? Is it a board of selectmen or a board of trustees? Aldermen, okay. That really follows New York. New York had aldermen on their board. That's interesting, and it was from the very beginning, as far as you know, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Interesting. Okay. Now, I say that these local town groups, boards of trustees, aldermen, whatever, are elected by the residents of that town. So let's do a little more brainstorming. Who was eligible to vote in Colonial New York? Men. Well, you have lots of answers for this. Women didn't vote. It was men. And I heard, did I hear adult males? You had to be 21. Okay, you know all about this. This is great. And they had to own a certain amount of property. The English, 40 pounds, 40 shillings. I usually say adult white men. We don't know of any free blacks that voted, but if that ever turns up, and I wouldn't be surprised if it did, let me know, because that's something I'd like to add to research. So it's adult white males generally, and if they were in the countryside, which most of them were in those days, they had to own, according to the English model, 40 pound, 40 shilling freehold. That meant that if your property would sell for 40 pounds or would be leased for 40 shillings, then you would be eligible to vote. Now, in the towns, people didn't have big farms. This is the countryside, where you had the 40 pound, 40 shilling, but you could also be offered the freemanship of a city or a town. That's if you were a craftsman or had a profession, you were a citizen, you resided there, you would be given, it's like a borough right, I think it's sometimes called. And then you, of course, were eligible to vote. And it happens, and we had this researched in the last 4 or 5 decades, when we first discovered that in the colonies in the 18th century, more than 50% of the adult white males were eligible to vote. And that is an extraordinary number and greatly influenced our history and the revolution, because these people were being represented, were taxing themselves all those years in their local boards. What do you think the adult white male eligibility to vote was in England, for example, at a comparable time? And I'll let anybody answer this, just in case you know, which I don't think you do. I don't think I have a lecture about this at NYU. 5 to 15% of adult white Englishmen could vote throughout the 18th century. So it's a huge difference, and really is an important one, I think. So why did that happen? Because more land was available here once the native tribes had been pushed back. And the ways in which that happened is a fascinating story. There are many fascinating stories about colonial American history, and this is one that I would love to tell you, but maybe when we're going to have a Q&A afterwards, we can bring this up again. The way in which this happened through deeds and grants and so on from the Indians was by hook or by crook, and mainly by crooks, I will tell you. Including, incidentally, a certain place right near here that I drove through coming up, Livingston Manor. You know about Livingston Manor? That was 160,000 acres in its original manorial dimensions. And the way that happened is quite a story. So if anybody wants to talk about that when we get to the Q&A, let's do it. So, okay. It was because land was available, and so these adult white males could get the land and they could vote, and this made a big difference. The central government was in New York City. The Crown in Parliament would appoint a royal governor for New York, and he would be in the city governing the whole colony with his appointive council. The governor appointed the council. The only elected part of government was the local, until, of course, they had the assembly that came into being. All right. The assembly was finally established in 1691. And I want to look at a couple of, in the time I have, a couple of political episodes. We only have time for two that I think are quite significant. And the first one is actually the Jacob Leisler episode, which I think probably some of you are familiar with, but maybe others are not. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, just sort of outlining the main design of what happened then. But let me just tell you, because I think it's an absolutely fascinating period, and we are learning so much about this because of David Voorhees' work with the Leisler Institute, where he is searching for the documents to support that time, preserving them, archiving them, taking care of them, expanding into the English period after Leisler's demise, and it's just going to be quite revolutionary about the way people will look at New York, some of whom had never heard about this, and now everyone's beginning to hear about it. So David's doing a wonderful job. I'm just going to talk about 2 years at the height of this, well, a little bit more, but mainly 2 years. 1689 and 1691. And those 2 years, I think, set the tone for what happens politically in New York later. Because people in New York at that time broke into two factions. They either were for Leisler or they were against him, and that continued after Leisler was gone from the scene for 25 years. And the names of the factions that year who supported the government or who opposed it for some reason was they were either called Leislerians or anti-Leislerians. All that time after that period. So just a quick sketch of how this all came about. There was a hiatus of power on the throne of England when James II, King James II, was expelled from the throne in 1688, called the Glorious Revolution. And that's what the name that it acquired later on. And the reason he was expelled was because he finally admitted that he had returned from Protestant to Catholic. And you remember that Henry VIII had broken with Rome 130 years earlier, and England was a very Protestant country by then. They didn't want to go back to a Catholic dynasty. So in 1688, James II and his wife had a son, and that meant there would have possibly been a Catholic dynasty. So they ejected him from the throne. He escaped to France, and William and Mary are the next to succeed to the throne. William was the Dutch Prince of Orange, and he was married to James's oldest daughter, Mary. So that's how this all happened. But what's really sometimes lost in this story is that between December of 1688, when James was ejected, and February, 2 months, of 1689, there was nobody on the throne of England. Everybody knew it was going to be William and Mary, but it took a while to get that settled. So when word of this reached New York, and it took a while, it was probably done until actually February of 89, that, am I right, David, that was the first word that came, and then maybe March a little later, before they
Well,
really...
they knew that William had invaded. In December, they learned that he had invaded.
They knew that James, William had invaded England, okay.
And they learned in February that the invasion had been a success.
Okay, so it was February, okay, that's good. So then William and Mary were supposed to name their new governor, who would be a Protestant, of course. But and they did, but that person was very delayed in arriving. So in the meantime, New York has nobody in charge. So who's going to be in charge? Leisler was one of 5 militia captains in New York City. And after some negotiations with some of the other ones, he agreed to take over. And later on, if you have questions about this, David, we have the best expert in the world here who will be able to fill you in on the details of this. So he was only to be governor pending the arrival of this new governor, but the governor was delayed, the new governor, for months. And during that time, New York was absolutely divided. They were either pro-Leisler or against Leisler. A very bitter period of politics followed. There was chaos in New York, and this was the time when the French took advantage of that and attacked Schenectady. 1690, that's the Schenectady Massacre you've probably heard of, where many people were killed. Meantime, Leisler was trying to govern, and he even called for an assembly. And it may have even met, but very briefly, but it didn't come into being quite yet. It was 2 years later. And in the end, when the new governor arrived, Leisler's enemies all got together and reported terrible things about him, and he was accused of treason. And in May of 1691, Leisler was hanged, and quoting from David's writings, till half dead and then beheaded. Now, I don't know of any other person in colonial America who was beheaded. If you do, let me know once again, because I don't think it happened. I think this was most unusual, but we can talk about that later too. In any case, this is a highly emotional, a highly tragic period in New York politics. And the political rancor, as I said earlier, among New Yorkers, Leislerian, anti-Leislerian, didn't end after Leisler's demise. And I looked recently, I have a list of governors, lieutenant governors, acting governors. There are 12 in the 25 years after Leisler is gone, who had that office in and out, sometimes just a few months at a time. The most unstable, turbulent period in New York politics that I think perhaps we've ever seen. So that's the first of the 2 political episodes that I want to talk about. You still hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Good. And the second one, I think maybe is a little more familiar, perhaps, or maybe not, to those of you who live up in the Hudson. So we're going to jump ahead to the 18th century, actually the 1730s, and this may have a familiar ring to you. This is the Zenger episode. John Peter Zenger was a German immigrant to New York. He was 13 when he arrived, and he became a printer, was trained as a printer, and he went to work for the only newspaper in New York. There was only one, the New York Gazette, in the 1730s. But in 1733, there was a huge dispute between the new royal governor, a man named William Cosby, just remember Cosby, and a popular local, named Lewis Morris, who was actually Chief Justice of the New York Supreme Court. They had a falling out. I won't go into the details because that doesn't matter. What matters is they had a falling out, and the governor ejected Morris from his office as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He ousted him from that position. Well, Morris didn't like that very much, and he gathered a group of his friends, other people who weren't very fond of Cosby, and they decided they would found a newspaper that was going to be something that had never happened before in the colonies, an opposition newspaper. It was going to oppose the government. It was founded for that reason. And they were not hiding that fact very well at all. Morris was way ahead of his time as a politician. He was very shrewd, and he really was the leader of this group with others who clearly also had grievances against Cosby. So, everybody's reading the newspaper because it was very well written and very exciting. This was all sort of scandalous in New York, but they're interested. This was called the New York Weekly Journal, was the name of Zanger's paper. Now, a newspaper opposing the government, much less a formed opposition, had no legitimacy at this time in the political culture. Even though we know that these factions existed, we saw it in Leisler's time, nonetheless, it was not seen as appropriate to behave that way. And in fact, it's true that the idea of a loyal opposition, we've heard that phrase, you're opposing something that the government's doing, but you're loyal to the idea of that government and its constitution and so on. That's a very sophisticated idea, isn't it? Kind of hard to imagine being able to both oppose and still be for. And maybe we're learning a good bit about that right now, actually. So this is not a kind of legitimate thing to do, what Morris is doing. But he, as I say, made no bones about it. And declared boldly, in fact, in the first issue of the journal, declared boldly in one of its very early issues that it would apply, and I'm quoting, the lash of satire to wicked ministers. And we know who the main wicked minister was in their view. So people are all abuzz about this in their coffee houses. This one fellow on the left is throwing a cup of coffee in the face of somebody he's arguing with. They have the newspapers laid out on the table. And there's an important footnote that I have to add to this, which is that the newspaper was written not by Zanger. He didn't write a single one of these articles. They were all written by Lewis Morris or James Alexander, his friends and others who had joined his faction, or even party we could call it, as they said about trying to get Cosby recalled to England. Now this period of these factions was manifested in two other ways, just quickly. There was a by-election in Westchester County in which two candidates, one was the governor's candidate, and actually Lewis Morris lived in Westchester County. This is for a seat in the General Assembly. And so Morris himself was the one who was going to stand for election for Westchester. But when it began, and so the people gathered the night before. I wish I could describe this. We have the best description of an election because this was all written up in Zanger's newspaper, and it's the best description of a colonial election ever printed. It absolutely has great detail, which I don't have time to go into. But I will just say they came in the night before, they lit bonfires and had their dinner, slept all night in tents or whatever, I'm not sure what they say. And then in the morning, the newspaper describes how they all got on their horses. These were over 350 people in Westchester County who were coming to vote. They got on their horses, and one party went this way, and the other party went this way around the town green, and as they passed each other, they tipped their hats. It's wonderful detail, absolutely a great description of our local election, almost the only one we have. It became clear, however, very quickly, once the election, which was viva voce, no secret ballot, you just spoke who you were for or said aye when the name was mentioned. It was very clear soon that Morris was winning, and so someone from the governor's side said, we need to count this vote. Sound familiar? We have to be sure the vote's correct. And so the sheriff, who is the governor's man, because the governor appointed the sheriff, and the sheriff was running this election, he was there supervising, and he decided at one point when he saw Morris was ahead, that he would throw out the 38 Quaker votes, which were all for Morris, and he did. Now, what would be the basis that you could throw out Quaker votes, particularly? Anybody have any idea? Quakers could not swear, as you had to do in these elections, that they had the right land or freemanship or whichever to be eligible to vote. They had to swear that that was true, and then they would cast their vote out loud. Everybody could hear who they were voting for. But Quakers don't take oaths. That's against their religion. They would affirm that they were for somebody, but that was the excuse that the sheriff used, and so he threw out 38 Quaker votes. But it didn't matter because Lewis Morris won anyway, quite handily. Okay, so that was one other way in which this factual period was manifested. The other one is that Morris decided the only way to get rid of this guy was to go to London. He had been there before, he had friends in London, and so he went over to lobby in person with the officials that be in England to recall Cosby from the governorship of New York. And he stayed for 1.5 years, almost that length of time. Meanwhile, in New York, Zanger's paper is turning out all of these articles, which of course Zanger doesn't write himself. The upshot of all of this was that this politically fraught period, and very interesting to read about, I mean, it's really fascinating stuff. Zanger was arrested for seditious libel, a very serious charge, and he was thrown in jail for 10 months awaiting trial. The trial finally was held on August 4th, 1735, and at that time in English common law, truth was not a defense against libel. In other words, if you were giving the truth, even with evidence, that didn't matter. All that mattered was whether or not the printer, Zanger, who was the accused, had printed the newspaper, and of course everybody knew he had. But Morris and his friends had hired a great lawyer from Philadelphia who came in to defend Zanger, and he simply, the lawyer, just overrode the English common law, and he did argue that they had proved, that they had shown that Cosby had done these terrible things. And so this is a jury of local, ordinary New Yorkers. They go out very briefly, and they come back, and they declare Zanger not guilty. So that was the end, sort of, for the time being. A major consequence of this period in the 1730s, and this particular case and all of its surroundings, is that whereas factions earlier, parties, as I said, were not legitimate, they had actually been seen as kind of symptoms of disease in the body politic, not legitimate. Now you began to hear in New York, occasionally in print, you didn't hear, you read in print or in the pamphlets, that maybe there was something that was not so bad about parties, and I'm going to give you a few quotations. Parties were seen in one article as, I quote, that's the one I don't want to quote. The language shifts, anyway, away from it being symptoms of disease to something more positive. Perhaps, one author writes, some opposition is not only necessary, but of service to the public. Then, a little bit later, we read, Parties are a check upon one another and serve to maintain the public liberty. These were radical thoughts of the time, and the only place that you read them, and this has been researched by the famous Harvard historian, colonial historian Bernard Bailyn, it was only in New York that this is happening. Another quotation a little bit later. Well, I should say that to be sure they don't go completely overboard and say, oh, it's all okay to have parties by any means. Unjust criticism, fake news, we might call it today, that was not good for the common good. So they agreed that that was not a good thing. But just clamor, and this is a quotation again, just clamor is all in caps in this particular article. Just clamor is the right of all free men to make. So these are all quotations from the 1730s, the Zenger period, but for the first time we're hearing positive properties being attributed to parties, to factions. They still call them factions usually. They trail away in quieter times, but the words have been said. They're out there. And as soon as things heat up again, like in 1749, we hear something even more radical. Parties were now, quote, so many spies upon one another, which protected the public against the encroachments of power and tyranny. You can see this is advancing tyranny now is in the picture. So New Yorkers were political innovators. Earlier than anywhere else, they could think beyond the wall of what was traditional in political thought to something that was, as Bailyn said, altogether new. And you can imagine, just to sort of think ahead for a minute, sort of a kind of sidebar, you can imagine how valuable this kind of thing was when you get to the American Revolution, when you're going to have an opposition formed against England. You need to have some reason to do that. And of course they made all that out of the Declaration of Independence. But the politics is changing, and it's changing first in New York. Okay, so let's kind of skip ahead and summarize a little bit, or rather, skip ahead to the national period, because there are a few evidences there of the case that I'm trying to make to you, and that is that New York is foretelling us what the nation is going to become. So that now you've had the revolution, the Constitution's been written, you're into the 19th century, and in 1817, when parties were still not fully accepted, it takes another decade almost, but New Yorkers, with all their experience, are realizing you could make compromises at times, you could sometimes accommodate far enough to get something done in these legislatures. So in 1817, New Yorkers accomplished a great feat. They debated for a long time, then they came together, and the New York legislature agreed to build the Erie Canal. Now, this was a very important thing, and I just have to give you a tiny bit of background. We're almost finished. What did I do with vitamin C? Oh, we'll get into that in a minute. It's okay. What was happening at this point was, and this is 1817 when they start, and it takes 8 years before the canal is finished. The New Yorkers want to tap the riches of the interior of the country, because remember the Louisiana Purchase had happened, and that means that there's all that new Northwest territory out in the Ohio Valley and beyond, which is now filling with people. They're going to have trade, they're going to need goods. Somebody has to tap that commerce. And if they don't, nobody on the East Coast does, it's all going to go to the Mississippi. And the East Coast will be out of luck. So both Pennsylvania and New York want to find a way to get into that interior. And they both have possibilities, but Pennsylvania has a problem. They have two strong lobbies. One is a canal lobby, and the other is a railroad lobby. Wants to build a railroad instead. And because the railroads are just coming into use around this time in this country. And they can't, they just fight back and forth. And so New York gets there first. And in 1817 they decide and they begin this project. of building the Erie Canal to tap those riches. New Yorkers overcame their differences, they worked together, and the Erie Canal was built. And as, I don't have a map of that actually, but you don't need a map, you know what happens. Starts in Lake Erie at Buffalo. The canal actually runs along to Albany. And then of course, once you get, it's a long distance, very expensive project. Once you get to Albany, you're into the Hudson, down to New York and out to the Atlantic and the world. So that is what they did. They built that, and in 1825, Governor DeWitt Clinton, who had chaired the commission to plan this canal, and I will show you a very famous picture, took a keg and got water from, I mean, he did it personally, but was handed a keg of water from Lake Erie, traveled this route all the way to New York City, and poured the Lake Erie water into the Atlantic Ocean in New York City. It's called the Wedding of the Waters, and this is a wonderful, there are many, many images of this. But that actually happened, and thus in 1825, New York achieved this great ability to tap those interior riches, and of course this is why New York then, the population in New York swelled immediately, and New York was on its way to becoming the commercial and financial capital that it became, and still is today, certainly of the United States, and we might even say of the world. Okay, one last little touch and I'm done, so we can get to questions. This is just to clinch my argument completely. Above all other colonies, New York prefigured what the nation would become. In 1837, the first presidential candidate to openly proclaim the virtues of parties, and he himself used his own experience of manipulating factions, of turning out the vote. They called him the Little Magician. His name was Martin Van Buren of Pinkerhook, New York, was elected the 8th president of the United States. And there he is. And I think that's a good place for me to stop, and maybe we can turn on the lights a little bit more brightly and have some questions. And I hope you have some questions. Yes.
You mentioned early on you mentioned the anti-Catholicism in New York, and you pointed to a map, but you didn't say explicitly the relation. Was it that New Yorkers were afraid that the Catholics were associated with the French?
Yes, let me clarify it a little bit more. New France, or French Canada, was a French colony that was founded actually before the English colonies, or at least the area was explored. And it was a Catholic colony. The church, just about everybody up there was Catholic. There may have been a Protestant or two, but not many more. And so that was associated with French Canada in the minds of New Yorkers. And it was those Catholic French Canadians who were coming in and causing problems for them. So that was the reason. But also, that's also why the Navy and those four companies that I was describing, British soldiers, the only place where you had British army companies in the colonies was New York up until the French and Indian War in the mid-18th century. It was only in New York, and it was to protect against those kinds of invasions. Yes, that's the reason, right.
And will you tell the Livingston story, please?
Which story?
The Livingston story.
Oh, the Livingston story. Does anybody know if Sunbach Kim is still, or he lives upstate?
Of course.
Pardon me?
Yes.
You do know him?
Yes.
And I was hoping maybe he might come, because he's a great expert on Livingston Manor and all the other manors and the land holdings in New York. There's a lot of myths about manors. They weren't lords of manor. I mean, I'm sorry. All those feudal things.
This book was Landlord and Tenant.
It is.
I don't know, the library.
Oh, I'm sure they must have a copy of it. I mean, it's a fabulous
It
book.
is just great because
Yeah.
it's all of it.
No, he's the expert on this whole thing, and I knew him well, but I haven't seen him for a long time. But Livingston Manor was one of several very large land holdings that was given. And of course, these land grants came from the indigenous tribes initially. They had to turn this stuff over. Sometimes you could go to these meetings. I don't know if I mentioned that the governors of New York were responsible for meeting with the Iroquois nations each year in order to try to keep them loyal to the English, which they usually were, in order to fight the French. They didn't, if they were neutral, okay, that was the least thing they wanted, but they didn't want them to go over with the French. Great rivalry back and forth. But it is true that lands were granted by Indians, sometimes by very minor sachems of a tribe when they had too much rum, and gave the land away when it took the whole tribe to agree to it, including the women, by the way. They had a role in this, in their culture. And so the particular story about, well, yeah, I'm sure this is the way it happened. That's why I wish Sunbach were here, because he could confirm or say what really happened. But my understanding, and I researched this a little bit recently, is that Robert Livingston, who came to New York in the 17th century and was the first lord of the manor, although they never called him Lord Robert, believe me, they just laughed up their sleeve if anybody tried to be a lord. We had no aristocracy like England in the colonies. He had 3 small parcels of land he'd gotten. And if you look at Livingston Manor, which unfortunately I tried to get an image of, but I wasn't able to do it. One is at the very bottom, what became Livingston Manor was maybe a couple hundred acres. And then there's one in the middle, which was equally small, and then one up at the top of what became this 160,000 acre manor. How could that possibly happen? It's by cheating in various ways, including, as I just described, when meeting with the Indians, but also misreading the boundaries that are mentioned in the deeds, which the Indians had signed on to along with the colonials. For example, these deeds, it's fascinating to read them. It might be, a boundary might be marked by a heap of stones, or by the place where the old dam stood. And that was probably a beaver dam that had long disappeared. The heap of stones had been scattered. These were the kinds of markers that are apparent in these deeds. And Robert Livingston became a good pal of the governor in the 1680s, I believe is when Livingston Manor was granted. And Dongan was the governor who was his friend and helped to achieve this. And he got this manor patent from the governor, 160,000 acres. But I'm sure that it was that way that they intentional misreading of boundaries. And then, of course, right away, of course, the English would survey and get their own boundaries set up. And that's how many of these large land grants were given. The governors had the power to give land to people later after that had been taken from the Indian, and taken is the word. And you had to be friendly with the governor in order to get them. And so there's all kinds of shenanigans going on. But I think Livingston Manor is one of the most egregious in a sense. It was so big. Rensselaerswyck, which was the one manor that was, they didn't call it a manor, or did I guess they did, from the Dutch period, was 1 million acres. But that was very hurtful, even so. I don't know how we got that. Maybe David knows. And that was broken up. I think that the Claremont part of Livingston Manor is actually from the Rensselaerswyck original patent. But it's a fascinating story. It's fun to do research on this kind of stuff. Yes.
I was wondering, since the Dutch were here first and not for that long settled New York before it was taken over by the British, there must have been some influence in political thought and philosophy that influenced the English as time went on, because the original people were, they had their own system of petition and everything, the Dutch.
The Dutch did.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering if there was a connection or an influence from one to the other.
Oh, I'm sure there was, and even after, of course, another one was taken over by the English, that didn't mean the Dutch disappeared.
Yeah.
By any means. In fact, Joyce Goodfriend, who's one of the historians of early New York, found that up to 1830, the Dutch were either a majority or equal to the English, and that's only after, not 1830, I'm sorry, 1730, into the 18th century, that's only then did the English begin to, in Manhattan, outnumber the Dutch. So, and the Dutch, of course, spread all over New York, especially up the Hudson River, and along these villages and Albany and North and West, and they're still here, and maybe some of you are they, because I remember not long ago I went to Albany and I looked at the telephone book under van, pages and pages and pages of van this, van that. I happen to be Dutch partly on my father's side, so I've always been interested in this. And as I say, now that we're having, for years, you know about the translation project at the museum, the library in Albany, that Charles Gehring has been doing for 50 years, about? Not about 40, I think it is, he says, usually. The reason the Dutch were left out of the story, much more even than the middle colonies for so long, is because people didn't read Dutch. And the records were there, some of them were burned in the library fire, or singed around the edges, you can still see the singes. But now, once they started being translated by Charles Gehring, and first transcribed and then actually translated into English, now they could be used by scholars. And now this whole area of interest is very lively, lots of stuff's coming out. And I think the story will be told along with Leisler's in a new way, but it took a long time. So we all should have been able to read Dutch instead. Yes?
You mentioned the Congregationalists and New England, who I always sort of envisioned as being very participatory and somewhat democratic.
The
Aside
church,
from all the prejudice.
government itself, yes, you're absolutely right.
And I didn't hear you say anything about similar sort of participatory levels in New York. Now let me just throw in my prejudices here. I've always had this prejudice about the patrons of New York State, because I've read a good bit of Vermont history, and the Green Mountain Boys were formed as a militia to protect themselves against the raiders from New York State. And anyway, I'm just sort of confused about the level of democracy, and I realize that in that era, you know, you can't say a lot of democracy. But
Okay, well, you're asking two very good questions, actually. I'd like to respond to each of them. Don't let me forget about the Vermont border. But first about the church government and whether it's democratic or not and how this might have influenced. I agree, has huge influence. You have essentially two forms of the government. The Congregationalists, yes, they were a Reformed church. They were out of the Church of England, which they thought still had too many Catholic kinds of parts to their religion. And so they left the Catholic Church and they were Reformed, part of the whole Reform movement of Protestantism that moved out of Roman Catholicism initially. The Puritans took it another step and they left the Church of England, came over here and formed their own congregational religion. And it is a bottom-up kind of government. The people choose the minister, for example. In England, he's appointed by a bishop. You don't have a bishop in Reformed churches, and that would be Dutch Reformed, German Reformed, French Reformed, the Congregational churches, the Presbyterian, they're all Reformed. Presbyterian is a Scottish Reformed church. They all build from the bottom up, and I think it's very significant, because when you get to the revolution, these people are used to participating in their government. Again, another reason they're not going to be taxed without being represented. It's not taxes they worried about. It's because they were used to being represented in their churches, in their civil governments, And they were taxing themselves. They didn't, nobody likes to pay taxes, but they did tax themselves. But now, Parliament was going to tax them way over there, you know. So that, I think it's very significant. These Reformed churches, which are far outnumber, they're called dissenters by the Church of England. The dissenters far outnumbered the Church of England by the time of the Revolution in the colonies. And they were used to this participatory democracy, so I think so. And in terms of the Vermont border, what part of that? It just the Green Mountain Boys and their resistance.
I was just throwing that in as an objection to the New York system, but you've clarified some of it, that my view was kind of wrong.
No, I don't know that it's wrong, and I'm not sure I can fully answer your question, but it was New York that they thought was going to give them trouble. There was a lot of questions about the borders, because when these colonies were chartered, many of them were chartered sea to sea. That meant from the Atlantic to the Pacific. I mean, you know, that was in somebody's imagination. And so the claims became very complex and overlapping. And I know you're right that Vermont had trouble with New Hampshire and especially New York in claims of land for their borders, but that's about all I know, but you're absolutely right. Does anybody else have an answer about those borders and how they were decided upon? I'm sure there were surveyors involved, yes?
Well, I believe Ethan Allen, he even tried to persuade sort of the Vermont to go with Canada. You know, separated from New Hampshire, and after the Revolution, he had, sympathy to go to, Canada. That's how the rivalry, was.
Right, there was a rivalry certainly. Also, I was reading not long ago, Abigail Adams, John Adams' wife, who writes wonderful letters. I'm doing a project on her. She, during the Revolution, wrote to John and said that she had looked at some lands in Vermont. And it surprised me because I had not known that about her before. And she actually ended up buying. She wanted sort of to have all their family settle up in Vermont for some reason. So that suggests to me that Massachusetts also sort of was looking up there to make some claims. But that's a good project to research, and I will try to look into it. Thank you for raising it. Any other questions? Maybe we're getting close to out of time. Almost. We have 4 more minutes. Anybody have one last question to ask? If not, I thank you very much for